liberalization, the extensive liberalization would also have put the ESC industrialization process at risk. The ESC, and this would have discouraged the development of new industries. Furthermore, with such a liberalization schedule, promoting value additions through agro-processing would have been much constrained and would have compromised food security given the supportive linkages between agriculture and manufacturing. The extensive liberalization would also have had an effect on ESC's agricultural production and food security. The EPS, indeed, the combination of the extensive liberalization, the weak multilateral and bilateral safeguards on the one hand, and the domestic subsidies in the EU on the other would also have impacted negatively on the ES agricultural production and food security, making the EU agricultural products cheaper than those of the ESC. The EU undertook not to grant export subsidies to all agricultural exports to the ES partner states. However, the real challenge to the ESC's agricultural production and industrialization are the ever-increasing domestic subsidies in the EU, which issue the EU has declined to discuss both in the EPS and in the WTO. The EPS would also have undermined the South-South cooperation, and it would also undermine regional integration through the balkanization of Africa. For example, what's happening today, Kenya and Rwanda signed. Now Kenya wants to ratify and conclude and implement. This is likely to have far-reaching implications on the sub-regional and continental integration prospects. It also has far-reaching implications on the African Continental Free Trade Area, the CFTA, as it prescribes the kind of CFTA Africa will have in place. This is because the RECs have been designated in the CFTA as the building blocks. The EPS would have and would deepen divisions between African countries, making African trade policy harmonization even more difficult. The EPA, as they were and how they are still are, have the rendezvous clause, whereby the ES and the EU undertook to conclude the negotiations in areas of services, investment, government procurement, trade and sustainable development, intellectual property rights, competition policy within 5 years upon entry into force of the EPA. It should be noted that the ESC is yet to put in place joint frameworks for some of these issues. For example, government procurement and intellectual property. The region has just put in place a regional competition policy. The above contentious issues raised by President Yoweri Museveni and by the government of Tanzania have made the negotiation drag on and on for more than 2 decades. Yet these issues have not yet been resolved. These contentious issues are still valid today. And given the polycrises which we are facing as a region, that's debt, climate, economic crisis, and given the EU, the Russia-Ukraine war, And given the fact that the EU ESEPA is still the same, other than the addition of a sustainability chapter, we are saying that these EPAs are still not good for the region. What are the potential implications of Kenya EU EPA? It's paramount to understand and to appreciate the reason for Kenya signing the EPA with the EU. The 21st Ordinary Summit of the East African Community Heads of State decided that the partner states that wish to do so may commence engagement with the EU with a view to starting the EU ESCEPA implementation under the principle of the variable geometry. The principle of variable geometry is provided for in Article 7.1e of the ESC Treaty. It states that the principle of variable geometry allows for progression in cooperation among groups within the community for wider integration schemes in various fields and at different speed. The proposal to invoke the variable geometry principle in the EPA is a misapplication of this principle. There is no doubt that this principle applies to integration within the ESC and does not apply to third parties. If wrongly invoked as recently applied by Kenya, it will lead to unintended consequences of fusing the ESC in the EU free trade area. This is because if Kenya implements the EPA, it will be part of the free trade area with the EU, and by default, the entire region would be in the EU, given the fact that the ESC has a common external tariff. What are our proposals on the way forward? There is a very, very urgent need to rethink the EPAs in order to make the EPAs address Africa's long-standing challenges and aspiration for structural transformation. These are the specific proposals to the government of Kenya. We appreciate the position of Kenya, given that failure to conclude the EPAs would lock the country out of the EU market. It should be noted that Kenya mainly exports vegetables, fruits, and flowers to the EU in 2021 to the tune of $1.3 billion, while importing mineral and chemical products as well as machinery worth $2.2 billion. That means that Kenya is exporting raw materials to EU and has a trade deficit of almost 1 billion. However, ESC is the biggest market for Kenya's value-added products such as cement, palm oil, coated flat wrought iron, soap, machinery. In 2021, Kenya's exports with the ESC stood at US dollars 2.05 billion. The imports amounted to 873 US dollars, providing Kenya with a trade balance of around 1.2 billion. Therefore, Kenya should rethink and prioritize the ESC regional integration because the ESC trade provides prospects for industrial development and structural transformation. Proposals to the ESC community. It would appear that by agreeing with Kenya's proposal to invoke the variable geometry principle, the ESC summit prioritized trading with the EU over ESC integration and the Continental Free Trade Area implementation. the CFTA implementation. This should be avoided in order to preserve, widen, and deepen the EAC integration and promote intra-Africa trade and investment as envisaged under the CFTA. Therefore, the EAC and other regs should not misapply the principle of variable geometry for purposes of concluding extra-regional FTAs. While Kenya has used this principle to justify concluding the EPA with the EU, this action will set a very dangerous precedent, undermining regional integration on the continent. In the context of the poly crisis, the EAC, through the Secretariat, should undertake a cost-benefit analysis of the impact of the EPA on the EAC economies. This will enable the EAC partner states to rationalize the decision whether to sign or not from an informed point of view. Moreover, this had been earlier requested by the government of Tanzania in 2017. For us, we think the issue of undertaking a cost-benefit analysis is more urgent than ever today. The EAC partner states should reconsider and follow up on the African Union's proposal to the EU, which was entitled Common and Enhanced Trade Preference System for LDCs and low-income countries. Under this proposal, the EU recommends that the EAC region should be treated by the EU as an LDC region, which should benefit from duty-free, quota-free market access, given the fact that the region is predominantly an LDC region, with only one country, Kenya, designated as a developing country. Our proposals to the Parliament of Kenya and the East African Legislative Assembly. As noted in the press release by the European Commission, the EU-Kenya EPA will, upon legal scrubbing and translation, be presented for signing and ratification, and that other member states may join. As the representatives of the people, the members of Parliament for Kenya and for EALA should play their oversight role by debating this agreement and consulting their constituencies to ensure that the interests of the people they represent are catered for in the EPAs before it being signed and ratified, and before other member states are stampeded into joining it. To the African Union, the AU should boldly pursue its agenda of promoting structural transformation through focusing on regional integration and the CFTA, beginning from the REX as building blocks as envisioned in the Lagos Plan of Action. In its current form, the EU-Kenya EPA undermines this important vision. Africa should not be rushed to integrate with other continents, but should instead look inwards and consolidate a regional integration. We therefore propose that the EU-Kenya EPA be discontinued and those which have been signed be withdrawn. This will allow for the much-needed policy space for the East African region and African countries to use the regional integration process and the CFTA for industrialization and for structural transformation and for the development of competitive regional value chains. Moreover, the multiple crises faced by African countries have put into question the efficacy of the neoliberal paradigm that has governed free trade agreements like the EPA. It's also therefore opportune for us as Africans and as East Africans to reassess, review, and restructure the EU-Africa trade and investment relations in order for Africa to achieve her development aspirations. We would also like to recall that during the 31st AU Summit held in Mauritania in 2018, the heads of state and government urged member states to abstain from entering into bilateral trade arrangements until the conclusion of the CFTA negotiations. Our proposals to the European Union, we wish to reiterate that it's grossly unfair for the EU to be negotiating separate free trade agreements with individual countries within a regional economic community which has even a common external tariff. Yet, it's unthinkable that one European member state, for example, Germany, can enter into a free trade agreement with the ESC while remaining as a member of the EU. This can't happen. Then we are asking, why is the EU doing this to ESC and to Africa? Therefore, we are requesting that the EU should address its fragmented trade policy towards Africa, especially given its decreasing share of Africa's export to the EU, especially in value-added products. We are also proposing that the EU and the Kenya can review the earlier EU preferential offer to the SCP countries which granted preferential tariff treatment for products originating in SCP states. We are requesting that the EU should also treat the ESC region as an LDC region, which should benefit from duty-free, quota-free market access. And this is given that Kenya, the region is predominantly an LDC. This is in line with the Africa Union proposal for the Common and Enhanced Trade Preference System for LDCs and low-income countries. One of the stated objectives of the EPA is to promote regional integration. However, our 20 years experience from the EPA negotiations indicate that the EU has been using underhand methods to put African countries under undue pressure to choose between regional unity and solidarity on the one hand and access to the EU market on the other. The EU-Kenya EPA, if individually signed, ratified and implemented by Kenya, will deepen divisions between the ESC countries. And the ESC, the choice they have is either to choose between the ESC solidarity or to let Kenya go on its own. Therefore, what we are requesting EU, that in pursuit of its global trade policy of prioritizing access to raw materials, as evidenced by the EU Raw Materials Initiative of 2008 and the EU Critical Raw Material Act, the European Union should desist from underhand techniques to put countries in untenable situations where they have to choose between their regional integration aspiration and market access to EU. Access to raw material from Africa has become a critical issue given the imperative for clean energy transition. In conclusion, the Kenya EU EPA presents a litmus test for EU's commitment to Africa's development. It also presents a litmus test for the EAC partner states whether to prioritize regional integration or whether to subordinate regional integration to integration with the EU. We wish to recall the late Benjamin Mkapa, the former president of Tanzania. He gave us this advice that before concluding a comprehensive EPA, we should ask ourselves the following questions. Will the EPA, 1, help us increase our domestic production capacities? 2, encourage diversification and industrialization. 3, increase food security. 3, provide quality employment. Will this trade agreement support our move from being largely natural resource exporters towards being producers of value-added products? Those were the questions which Honorable Benjamin Mkapa told us to answer. In our assessment, the answer is no to all those questions. Therefore, the answers to these questions should determine whether or not both the Kenya EU EPA and the broader EAC-EU EPA negotiations outcomes are acceptable to us, or whether Kenya and other partner states should sign, ratify, and implement the EPAs. It's our considered view that there is an urgent need to rethink the EU-Africa trade relationship in order to make this relationship mutually beneficial while addressing the long-standing challenges and Africa's quest for structural transformation. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jane, for the comprehensive statement on the Kenya-EU Economic Partnership Agreement. Before we go to the other participants, let me call upon Ms. Faith Monya to give us some insights. Faith as an economic justice and climate justice and action program lead and expert. What do you think this means in the quest for, for climate just and economic just trade and relationship between Africa and the EU? Over to you, Faith.
Thank you, Africa. And thank you, Jane, for giving that initial insight. I think it does present an important starting point for the conversation that we will have ahead. I am going to suggest that I put off my microphone, my video. I don't know if, can you hear me clearly?
By all means, yes. Yeah, you can have it or you can remove it. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Then I think I can leave it on. So I am Faith Monya, and I work with Akina Mama Africa as the Economic Justice and Climate Action Lead. And I am grateful to still be part of this conversation. So thank you, Siatini, for inviting me. So I think for me, I wanted to start by emphasizing some of the recommendations that Jane highlighted from the statement. And I think it's important for us to really emphasize the need for the Kenya government not to sign and ratify this agreement. And really, it's in the spirit of regional integration, not just for the EAC, but for the broader broader African continent as a whole, and especially given that the AfCFTA is trying to deliver on the African Agenda 2063. So it's important that in the spirit of the African Agenda 2063, but also regional integration that the Kenya government doesn't sign. But also, I think it's important, like Jen said, for us to call upon EAC partner states, but also the EU leaders, AU leaders, the African Union leaders, to reject this extractive agreement. And I say extractive because of the ways in which it has been designed, in terms of, for instance, prohibiting export taxes, which we know are critical when it comes to industrial development. And then finally, we know that EU countries are in the process of developing feminist foreign policies. And when it comes to feminist policies, it's really about rejecting neoliberalism in all its forms. It's about centering the most marginalized and with the spirit of leaving no one behind. And so it's important that that we outrightly, that the EU does commit to implementing feminist foreign policies as they have already started, but also implement them both even when it comes to these trade agreements, because we've seen so many times that the EU commits towards social and environmental policies and different projects that are focused on enhancing livelihoods. But when it comes to their foreign economic and trade policies, they are doing completely different. So I think it's important to also begin to connect this conversation with what's happening within their different countries. I think for me, I would also like to reflect on why other EAC partner states rethought signing the EPAs in the first place. And I think for me, one of the most important things is to think about some of the gains that we have made, particularly within the multilateral system. So in terms of access to medicines and access to health, there were TRIPS flexibilities that were extended to least developed countries. A lot of FTAs, the way they are designed, they are usually TRIPS plus. And TRIPS plus meaning that they erode the policy space of countries to be able to implement flexibilities that would allow them to be able to produce generic medicines. So because this was one of the risks, in addition to all the other issues, issues to do with industrial development, issues to do with agricultural development, like Jen has highlighted, it's important for us to also reflect on the issue of access to medicines and the right to health. And it's unfortunate that even with these critical issues that are of concern, that the EU went ahead and pushed the Kenya government to get into having to negotiate and eventually take a political decision. I know that in many times media houses do question the idea of these developed countries pushing our African leaders to do things that would jeopardize the livelihoods of their countries and their people. But it's actually true when it comes to a lot of diplomatic processes that so many times our leaders find themselves in between a rock and a hard place and are unable to push back. And so I think for me, it's important to also reflect on that and highlight that as a concerning issue. I think the other thing that I wanted to also talk about is really the need for us to also reflect on the hypocrisy of the EU, because since the colonial era, the European Union and European countries have actively been involved in the economic development of our countries. But when you see, for instance, the amount of investment they have made in terms of industrialization, it's difficult to to actually take to register substantial industrial development that's aligned to their investments. And so it's not surprising that even this particular agreement, but also the EPAs, as we discussed them a few years ago, are really focused on seeing how the EU can continue to access raw materials from our countries at duty-free. And like Jen mentioned about the EU global raw material strategy, you see that the EU is actually committed to ensuring that they can be able to access raw materials at the cheapest possible price. The EU, while being a key importer of coffee from our continent, has done very little to invest, for instance, in value addition. And we've seen a lot of concerns raised by different media houses of how we continue to lose a lot of money because we are constantly exporting coffee beans, and that the level of value addition is very low. The other thing I wanted to talk about is also when you think about the investments that a lot of EU actors have undertaken, and particularly in the horticulture sector, we know that the Kenya government has emphasized how important the horticulture sector is to the economy of Kenya. But we also know that the horticulture sector has largely developed, and even the profits that have been obtained from this particular sector is on the backs of women working in flower farms, who are paid very little wages, who work without sufficient protective gear, who operate with, and in many cases, without access to maternity leave. And the list can go on and on. And yet this is a sector that the government of Kenya continues to front as an informant in terms of signing this particular agreement. I think it's important that we do, even in terms of weighing the costs and benefits, like Jen said, that the costs and benefits also in the assessment of that also take into account the social, the unquantified effects on human beings and on people, particularly those who are at the margins of society. I think the other thing that is important to highlight is the connection between agreements such as this and tax treaties. And we know that when trade happens, duty-free, quota-free, besides that duties that we are foregoing, there is also illicit financial flows that leave our countries. And but also because of the kind of trade arrangements we have made, but also because of the kind of tax treaties that we have made. So it's important to make the connection because there's a lot that African countries have continued to lose, both in legitimate but also illegitimate ways. Recently, The Guardian published a story that revealed that the Dutch, through the slave trade that they conducted here on the continent, that more than 545 million euros was lost from Africa. And that's just the Dutch alone. So you can imagine how much, if we were to total the total amount that we lost to the colonizer, but also through slave trade. And so when we are thinking about the sacrifices that we are making, the opportunities that our governments are awarding, and in this case, duty-free market access to Europe, to Kenya, it's important for us to also reflect on what we have already lost, and therefore get our governments to rethink some of their decisions. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that this agreement also is an attempt to legitimize continued extraction. And like we've already talked about the EU material strategy, we also know that, and this is something that Jen also hinted on when she talked about the green energy transition, we know that the EU is currently seeking resources to implement their global Green New Deal. And we know that for them to be able to implement the global Green New Deal, they'll need certain resources from the African continent. And so by establishing such a treaty is really an opportunity for them to pave way for them to be able to access our resources duty-free. We've also seen that even within the WTO, global South countries, developing countries, African countries are being asked to sell their rare minerals to the global North for this particular purpose, which is really a process of legitimizing continued extraction. And then finally, as I conclude, I also wanted to talk about the issue around the principle of most favored nation treatment. With this particular provision, which is also found in a number of bilateral treaties, and in this case, the EU-Kenya trade agreement, under the principle, the EAC, if Kenya decides to sign and ratify this particular treaty, the EAC partner states will not be able to undertake special arrangements with other parties without the EU benefiting from these arrangements. The agreement, in effect, then would undermine South-to-South cooperation. So in this case, if an EAC partner state decided to negotiate a treaty, say with China or with Brazil, the EU would automatically have to enjoy that deal. So a lot of global South countries will have second thoughts about entering deals with EAC countries, and that then also undermines our own benefits, our own capacity to benefit from such arrangements. And we know with the changes in the global economic architecture, it's clear now that it's important for us to strengthen our South-to-South cooperation. And if this agreement will jeopardize that, then it's important that it is rethought. We know that the MFN principle also risks undermining the AFCFTA because Kenya has negotiated a broader EPA than the one covered under the AFCFTA. So in effect, it erodes African people's policy space. It erodes our government's policy space. It also undermines the AFCFTA because if it impairs the functionality of the regional economic communities like Africa said earlier, and specifically in our context, the common external tariff in the EAC and the common market, then the AFCFTA process will be slowed down and it will basically be affected. And our dream of, as highlighted within the Africa Agenda 2063 will then not be attained. Thank you, Africa. And Siatini, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Faith. Yeah, that's a very original and different approach to the EPA, especially the aspect of the energy transition and how access to critical raw materials to enable the transition happen should be seen as one of the issues which are less spoken about, but which are rather important in terms of the EU's interest in not only securing a deal with Kenya, but also in trying to convince Kenya to ensure that Kenya allows other EAC partners to join the EPA. Our last speaker, before I open up the general participants, is Mr. Ranga Machemedze. Ranga is the Executive Director, CIT in Southern Africa. Southern Africa has also been having a deep EPA negotiation, where Zimbabwe is currently engaged also. And so maybe, Ranga, as you're coming in, what are those issues that we need to be aware of when it comes to the EPA? How do you relate the Kenya EPA with also the deep EPA that is happening in the Southern Africa, 5 countries: Comoros, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Mauritius, and those five countries. What do you think are the aspects we need to look out for, and also what do you think are the key issues that we need to watch out for, especially for Kenya, as the EPA now goes into legal scrapping and ultimately ratification by the Kenyan Parliament and EU and implementation? Over to you, Ranga.
Thank you very much, Africa. Can you hear me?
It's loud and clear.
Wonderful. Now let me just put on my video such that just like Faith, you can also see this face from Southern Africa. Let me also take this opportunity to thank Jane Nalunga, for setting the tone and for highlighting the critical issues that are associated with the Kenya EU Economic Partnership Agreement, and also to Faith for the issues that you have also highlighted, which basically are the concerns of civil society with regards to EPAs. Now, speaking from Zimbabwe, particularly looking at the Economic Partnership Agreement between the EU and the 5 countries from the so-called ESA region, Eastern and Southern Africa region, and also the EPA between the EU and the so-called SADC EPA countries. I think you can already see, when we talk about regional integration, the challenges that the EU has brought onto the African continent when it comes to regional integration. I have to emphasize the point that when negotiations on the Economic Partnership Agreement started around September 2002, one of the critical issues that were raised then was that the EPAs were supposed to be concluded by the regional economic communities together with the EU. That's when we started to see negotiations taking place between COMESA countries, to which Kenya, in this regard, Uganda, countries like Zimbabwe belonged, and also the SADC countries, which has got also 15 countries. They were supposed to conclude this agreement as a region. But along the way, obviously, technical and political hurdles came along, and we started to see the disintegration in courts of African countries when they were negotiating the EPAs. And that's when you realized some countries from the so-called ESA countries, Eastern and Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, Comoros, Seychelles, Madagascar, Mauritius, they signed an agreement in 2009, and implementation started in 2012. In terms of SADC, which we know, the Southern African Development Community, which we know has got 15 countries, now 16 countries. During that time, it had 15 countries. You also started to see just 7 countries negotiating, and now 6 countries have signed the agreement and they've started implementing. That is Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, South Africa, Mozambique, and Eswatini, Swaziland. These are the countries that are implementing the Economic Partnership Agreement. Now, there are a lot of challenges, a plethora of challenges that we have seen in the implementation of the Economic Partnership Agreement, but I'm not going to repeat what Jane and Faith have already highlighted. There are just some critical issues that I think I should just highlight and perhaps also emphasize on which we should be on the lookout, particularly looking at the agreement with Kenya. Jane raised a very important aspect with regards to the trade deficit between Kenya and the EU. And she said there is a trade deficit of about $1 billion. And this deficit, if you look at it, what it simply means is Kenya is importing more than it is exporting to the EU. And this is a real challenge when you sign a trade agreement where you think you want to boost your trade with the particular region that you are signing the agreement with. In this regard, what is important and what is essential for African countries is to produce goods and services that are tradable internationally. And this is the challenge that we are having. The trade deficit that we are seeing between Kenya and the EU is only showing us that Kenya is exporting less than it is importing from the EU. And by implication, it means it's producing less tradable products. And the majority of the products that it is importing are actually manufactured goods. And this is where my point is when it comes to economic partnership agreements. They are supposed to increase the productivity and boost productive capacities of African countries. Yet this is not the case. I was just going through what the EU have said about the Kenya EU Economic Partnership Agreement. They have actually gone to town about this agreement. And just to quote some of the issues they have raised, they said this agreement, it consists of binding and enforceable provisions, particularly around climate issues, around environment issues, gender equality, and workers' rights. Now, we have to ask ourselves, without downgrading the importance of these issues, we are not discounting the importance of these issues on workers' rights, environment issues, etc. But what is critical for African countries is to be able to produce. If you look at that agreement, does it have binding and enforceable provisions, for example, on the following issues? One, technology transfer, which is one of the critical enablers of production, which is one of the critical enablers of manufacturing. African countries need to manufacture goods. They do not need to export raw materials, like what Faith and Jane were talking about. What is required? We have the raw materials, but what is needed is for us to value add those raw materials. And what is critical is to have the technology to value add and manufacture goods, which are then able to put us on an equal footing with the EU when it comes to international trade. So do we have binding and enforceable provisions that will allow technology transfer? No, we do not have, which is one of the critical areas that we should be looking at when we talk about an EPA being an agreement that will facilitate the development of the Kenyan economy. Secondly, do we have binding and enforceable provisions for capacity building, particularly for the producers, for the farmers, for the manufacturing sector? Faith was talking about the horticulture industry of Kenya being the mainstay of the trade between Kenya and the European Union. Now, if these producers do not have the capacity to meet the standards that are required by the European Union, so where does the EU coming in? Where does the EPA agreement coming in terms of boosting the capacities of the producers to meet not only the EU standards, but also to meet the local standards? Because what is required is to produce goods of a quality that are tradable locally and even internationally. Do we have binding provisions for that? There are no binding provisions for that, which is why the EU Economic Partnership Agreement with the African countries, and in this regard with Kenya, is a challenge, because it is only facilitating the export of raw materials. If you remember very well, if I remember around 2010, when we had the volcanic ash in Europe, I remember very well that Kenya was losing about $2 million per day, because flights could not leave Nairobi to go to Europe with the cut flowers. They couldn't do that. Now, the issue of diversifying the markets is really important, rather than just focusing on the EU market as if the market itself is the panacea to the development challenges that Kenya is facing, which is the issue that Jane raised earlier on with regards to focusing on the EAC markets for the goods that are produced in Kenya. So there is need to diversify the markets. But what the Economic Partnership Agreement is doing is it is narrowing the market for Kenya for its goods. And once you have challenges like the volcanic ash that I'm talking about, you can see what it does to your economy in terms of losing revenues on a daily basis. Thirdly, does the agreement have binding and enforceable provisions, particularly to support institutional development of the Kenyan economy, to support the implementation of the EPA itself? Now, colleagues, this is a very important issue that I want you to understand, particularly coming from the Southern Africa region, which is implementing an economic partnership agreement. If you read the provisions of the EU-Kenya agreement, it talks about safeguard mechanisms, the safeguards that have been put in place that Kenya perhaps could actually invoke if it realizes that the EPA itself, or the trade that it is doing with the EU, is having a detrimental effect on the Kenyan economy. It can invoke certain provisions of the safeguards to safeguard the Kenyan economy. Now, you cannot just do that without institutional capacity to be able to monitor the trade between the EU and Kenya. What this entails is, if you are to invoke those safeguards, you have to justify to the EU in terms of the prices, how the prices have been affected, in terms of how the production has been affected, in terms of the volumes, in terms of the impact, not only on prices, but also the impact, the effect that the trade between the EU and Kenya is having on the economy. Now, for you to be able to do that, you need to have strong institutions that are able to monitor the trade, that are able to calculate the impact of the trade. And once you do that, you have to justify to the EU, and it's a process that takes a long period of time. It's not something that can just happen overnight. And if you read the specificities, the details themselves that you find when you want to apply safeguards, if you go to the SADC EPA, for example, it has got a whole lot of details that are very difficult to apply, because the capacities that you need, it will take time for you to build those capacities. So the question that I have to pose to the Kenyan civil society and also to the Kenyan government is, does the country have the capacities, particularly from the competition authorities, in order to apply certain provisions of those particular safeguards if you are to apply them? So they just exist on paper, but the practical implementation of that is a real challenge, which requires strong institutional development. Do we have those institutions? And if I go back again to the period when negotiations on EPA started, one of the critical issues that in the phase one of the negotiations that were supposed to be put in place was to build these institutions. And we didn't see that happening. We didn't see our countries getting the support they needed, particularly technical support, financial support to build the institutions in terms of the technology, in terms of how you apply certain models, economic models, and so forth and so on. We did not see that happening. So there is a stage that we jumped already in terms of building these institutions, and we are already looking at signing the agreement and implementing the agreement. So these are some of the challenges that have to be dealt with. So it's not only the issues of standards, but also the issues around industrial upgrading, which is really critical to boost productive capacities, which are necessary for producing the goods that are required for the implementation of the agreement. Then another aspect that I also want to raise, something that we have also seen with the application of the EPA within the ESA region or the SADC region, is the issue of development assistance. If you read the text across the SADC EPA, across the ESA EPA, it talks about development assistance which the EU is able to give to the African countries, particularly to deal with adjustment costs, because remember, Jane was talking about issues of revenue losses, which are expected as a result of implementing the EPA. Most countries, they were surviving particularly on revenues from tariffs they were charging on products. If a product comes into your country, the moment it reaches the border or it reaches the airport or any port of entry, remember these goods were, charged some duties, some tariffs for them to enter the country. But now with the EPAs, it means these tariffs are going to be eliminated gradually, of course, until they come to zero. Now the question is, if these countries were relying on revenues from these tariffs to fund, for example, social services, to fund, for example, agriculture, to fund, for example, the manufacturing sector, how is the country going to adjust itself towards getting alternative sources of revenue? And this is where the EU comes in and say they have inserted in the EPAs some the so-called development chapters within the EPAs, where they provide some financial resources. It's not automatic that countries are going to get these financial resources. I was just going through the Kenya EU text on development assistance, and I realized that development assistance is going to be conditional, particularly upon the implementation of, remember, those issues, those enforceable binding provisions on workers' rights, on the environment, on climate, and also on gender equality. So if you do not, for example, meet certain obligations that are provided for in those provisions, then the development assistance will not come in. So one of the critical issues that we have to look at is, how do we make development assistance unconditional? It shouldn't be conditional upon implementing certain provisions. So these are the challenges that you find across the different EPA areas. I have to emphasize this issue of sustainability clauses.
As a concrete comrade.
As I conclude. Now, you will notice that the EU has now gone into a mode of infusing what it is calling sustainability clauses within the agreements that it is signing with different countries. Now, sustainability is presumed to assume a certain definition within the precincts of the EU's economic and trade sectors. But from our own perspective, for example, there is what they call a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which they are trying to introduce as part of sustainability. Now, if a country like Kenya is producing goods, perhaps with technology that affects the environment, with technology that increases the release of carbon monoxide and so forth and so on, it means its goods will not be able to be accepted within the European Union market. Now, the question is, do we have the capacity as African countries? Do we have the technology, the clean technology? This is where, in terms of negotiations, the agreement with Kenya should have been signed with enforceable provisions to say the EU is going to fund or to provide the technical assistance or to provide the technology for Kenya to produce with clean energy, for it to be able to meet the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. For example, just giving examples. So these are the give and takes issues that should be included as binding and enforceable provisions within such agreements. We can talk about all the other issues around regional integration, around substantially all trade and so forth and so on. But I thought I should just highlight these issues, Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ranga. Indeed, the issue of medicines, the issue of experiences from SADC and the Eastern and Southern African region, the aspects of sustainability and environment in regards to trade and how the EU is using them to a demand for more broader free trade agreements is very critical, and we need to really consider it. Especially under the fact that now the EU at the beginning of this year, last year, undertook a campaign of the EU in the listening mode, and it was basically aimed at assessing the relationship between EU and its partners for a better way forward. And yes, maybe the EU is not listening after all. Anyway, now it's the time to give it to the audience. Should you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to raise your hand and come in. Anyone having any question? I don't see hands yet. Boniface, can I preempt you to share with us what is happening in the EU side? Is the EU really listening? Or it is hearing, it is listening to us, but not hearing us? Boniface? Okay, it appears I have lost him, and it appears I do not have any questions or any comments. Yes, there is someone that is asking for the share of the recording and the statement. Both will be shared, and maybe as we cross this rather engagement.
Hello,
yes,
can I ask a question?
Please come on.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Luka Nami from Kenya. I'm a journalist at the East African. And my question is to the Saitini team. You have at least given us a statement on why Kenya should not have signed this partnership agreement, but you have as well elaborated and explained that Kenya would be losing money if it did not sign this kind of agreement. So which is which? Should Kenya have gone ahead to sign the agreement and maybe fail to export its flowers, or it should actually not have done it because it is under the East African community? So, and given that it is not an LDC, I just want some clarification on that.
A very important question from Luke and Nami indeed. Should Kenya sign? What would have been Kenya's fate if we are saying that should not have signed? You know, that's a very important question. Any other question, or see, I think we could take on this question, and then if there's others, we'll be able to have them. See, I think over to you. Answer the question.
Okay, thank you so much, and thanks to Comrade Ranga and Faith. When it comes to whether or not Kenya should sign and should conclude these EPAs, I think that the onus is on Kenya to weigh that cost-benefit analysis and the implications on the region. And we have clearly indicated, the benefits and the cost to Kenya and also to the region. And our proposal is that they shouldn't sign it. They shouldn't continue. Let us move as a region. And let us prioritize, Kenya should prioritize regional integration instead of looking at just flowers and vegetables. Let us look at the future, look at structural transformation, look at industrialization of the region, which we can't do if Kenya goes with signing the EPAs just for flowers and vegetables. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. But also just add, Comrade Bwana Luke, also the issue is that there were proposals that had been made by the African Union for the EU to treat the EAC as an LDC. In other words, the EU would have continued to allow Kenya access its market, duty-free, quota-free, without while allowing for other partner states to come on board and have all the reservations that they do have on the EPA addressed. So it appears that maybe there is some reluctance from the EU to be able to accept the proposal that was made by the Union, and that really questions whether really even though the EPA says that it wants to promote regional integration, whether really in reality whether the Balkanization that we are currently seeing might really result into regional integration. So that is the aspect. Okay, Simon is asking, we would like to get our thoughts on what such decisions by Kenya to sign for the EAC integration, what they would mean to sign for the what such decisions by Kenya would mean for the EAC integration agenda. Maybe, Faith, could you briefly just throw a few, like maybe 3 pointers on what this means? I think you could do recast what you had earlier shared, but also okay, these are also in the statement. But Faith, maybe if you might help, you could briefly recast them. And also, there's a question that after Kenya signing and ratifying, what will be next? So that's the question that I think Uganda is being posed to you and Ranga. What next after Kenya ratifying and signing? And do you think you could briefly speak about those issues on what this means for the EAC integration?
Yes, okay, thank you for that question. I think, like I had indicated, one of the risks that we see is that the EAC partner states will not be able to freely undertake special arrangements with other parties. And this then would undermine South-to-South cooperation. So for instance, I gave an example that if there is an EAC partner state that decided to negotiate a special arrangement with another country, say Brazil or India or China, the European Union would automatically enjoy that particular deal because of a provision within the agreement, which is called the most favored nation treatment provision. So the risk that we see is that because usually when countries sign a deal, that deal should benefit the 2 countries that have signed this deal. But in this case, because it automatically then applies to the EU, it changes the whole arrangement. And so there are countries that may have reservations around getting into certain special deals with us, which then undermines our own interest and our own capacity and freedom to be able to pursue certain arrangements for our own benefit. But also, I think it's important to note that it will not only just affect the EAC partner states, but it also has an effect on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area process. because, again, of that particular provision, since what has been negotiated by Kenya is broad, it's a broader economic partnership agreement. It basically risks undermining and eroding African countries' policy space to be able to pursue the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, because it effectively impairs the regional economic communities, which are the building blocks for the African free trade area or free trade agreement.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Faith, for breaking down the implications, the potential implications of the Kenya-EU EPA on the broader East African community trade, but also African Continental Free Trade area. There was a question to both Siatinis, Uganda and Southern Africa. What next after Kenya signing and ratifying? What happens next for that EPA?
Okay,
Then maybe,
thank you so much.
And then Ranga.
Thank you so much, Africa, and thanks to the questions. I also wanted to add on to what Faith has said about what happens if Kenya goes ahead and signs. Then very limited options. One, either like the statement was, others can also join. So other member states can follow and append their signatures. I remember their mark, put the mark on the agreement. I remember that's what our past leaders way back, the Shakas used to do. You attach, you put your mark on the agreement. So that's one option. If the EAC countries don't fight and agree, like the EU has said that we can join and we join, for us, we think that would really be very, very unfortunate, because there were long-standing contentious issues which were never resolved. In addition, they have put a new chapter on the sustainability chapter, which we haven't negotiated. So for the EU to agree, EAC to agree to append their signature on an agreement which they haven't negotiated, that would be very unfortunate. But that's one option, that we follow Kenya to the slaughter. Then two, EAC can demand to open up the negotiations. We open the negotiations up, starting from where the negotiations ended. And we have to remember that the EAC has now expanded to bring in South Sudan, to bring in DRC. Those are new members. And if an agreement is to be owned, those member states have also to be on board. So that's another option. Kenya, other member states can agree to Kenya to go ahead, and the EU goods we enter. I don't know what will happen to the CET. There will be a problem with the CET. For us as Siatini, we have started the struggle. Way back when the EPA started, we had a campaign, not to EPA, we are starting again. And we want to call the EU to order, that what they are doing is unacceptable. They speak one thing, they do other things. They are telling us they're in the listening mode, they go ahead and sign. They are telling us we want to develop Africa, that we want to promote regional integration, they do other things. That's really unfortunate. We continue calling EU to order, that what they are doing is not good. And we are continuing calling to order our EU, our EAC governments, that they shouldn't sell us out like that. So the struggle, Aruta, continue. The struggle continues.
Thank you, Jane. Maybe Ranga, you could answer this question instead, or you can add to this question. Njag is asking the very critical question here. that what would be the possible impact on Kenya if she fails to sign the EPA and loses access to the EU market? In other words, what would we be asking? What would you be asking? What would Siatini, Southern Africa, and Siatini, Uganda be asking Kenya to sacrifice if it fails to not to conclude the EPA with the EU? Over to you, Ranga.
Thank you very much, Africa, and thank you so much for asking this question. It's a very important question, which is very difficult to take for Kenya, but at the same time, which Kenya should be able to meet head on. Now, if it fails to ratify and implement the agreement, what it means is Kenya goes back to what is called the general system of preferences, where it can export to the EU, but what it means is the products that Kenya is exporting to the EU, they face a high tariff when they reach the EU borders, which makes it unsustainable for Kenya to export their goods to the European Union market. And this is why I said earlier on, diversifying our markets is really important, and rather than focusing on a single market. Jane said earlier on in the statement that the biggest market for Kenya is the EAC market, and this is what needs to be consolidated. And now with the coming on board of the African Continental Free Trade Area, this is the market that the Kenyan economy should be focusing on, a 1.2 billion market for African countries. And not only that, but also beyond that, the Asian markets and so forth and so on. So we are in a position to dictate the terms. We shouldn't let the EU dictate the terms to us when we have the goods that we can export. Yes, the GSP, the General Systems of Preferences, is in place. You can use that, or you can use the EAC market, which is there for your goods, or the African market, which is now being added. And Kenya, for example, is one of the 9 countries that are implementing now the so-called Guided Trade Initiative under the AfCFTA. And under the Guided Trade Initiative, it is meant to boost intra-Africa trade. This is what we should be focusing on. Boosting intra-Africa trade. The goods, the other goods, the manufactured goods that Kenya is importing from the EU, it can still diversify markets for importing goods that they require, the manufactured goods. So it's not like we do not have alternatives. There are hundreds of alternatives. We have alternatives. We only need to implement the alternatives. It's not all doom if we lose the market. So the issue is, we have to emphasize that Kenya should stand its ground and not implement this agreement. It will still get the markets that it needs for manufactured goods. It will still have the market that it needs for its own goods. So we have to diversify our markets, and that's the point that I have to emphasize.
Diversification and boosting intra-Africa, not only boosting, but prioritizing is what Comrade Ranga Machemeze is trying to emphasize, and that rather Kenya should focus more on ensuring that no deal should be able to.
What I have heard also is that some Kenya civil society organizations are preparing to take the Kenya government to the East African Court of Justice because we are in a regional integration. We have a common CET, and so on those grounds, even the grounds of variable geometry, they are taking the Kenya government to the East African Court of Justice. But what I also we appreciate that there will be losses for Kenya, losses in exporting flowers. But again, it's a matter of balancing, looking at the future of the region, looking at the imperative for industrialization and a structural transformation. And this is what we are calling upon upon Kenya, that the immediate losses the future will be brighter if we look at the regional integration. And then Kenya has to remember that the EPS, this trade agreements is not a matter of charity, because EU most often presents these agreements like they are helping us. We are giving you a market. But what is EU getting in return? We have also to look at that EU is getting something in return. EU is getting the raw materials, especially when you look at what we have said, the raw materials initiative. EU has to have those raw materials, especially when it comes to the new Green Deal. So we need to use those leverages to be able to work out a mutually beneficial agreement, instead of looking at it from one side that EU is doing us a favor, EU is giving us a market for raw materials only. We can be able to look for, like Ranga is saying, let us diversify where we are selling our raw materials to China, to wherever, but we need to leverage on what EU needs from us to be able to sign a win-win agreement.
Okay, thank you so much, Jen. And yeah, do we have any other question or comment? Okay, Ali Twaha, please come in, brother. Altra was applauding. I thought that it was a question. I thought it was a hand. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Do we have any other comment, proposal, or question? Okay, it appears that we have exhausted. I wish to thank you so much for for the patience and the contributions, the questions, the comments. We have shared the statement.
Just before you close, can I
come in, please.
Yes, I have heard your reply, but Kenya is complaining that it can't rely on Uganda or her neighbor Tanzania for trade, because just as you've seen with the maize the other day, Tanzania changes the rules in the middle way so that when you're buying maize, you can't actually buy the amount of maize you want because of new tariffs and new laws that actually forbid farmers from selling directly to Kenya. So Kenya has been arguing that it would rather go and secure its markets, especially for vegetables, for fruits, as well as even agriculture. I don't know what you have to say about that.
Yes, Luke is raising a very important question, and I wish really all the three panels can react to this. You are saying that we should preserve intra-Africa trade first. We should preserve EAC trade first. But your EAC is staggering, and so it is not creating that assured market. So briefly, can we have Faith? You're leaving, but can you come in briefly, and then you can. Faith has left. Faith, come in briefly, and then you can leave, and then Ranga and Jen can answer this question. Over to you, Faith.
No, I think I'll leave that question to Jen and Ranga, my senior.
Okay, thank you. So Jen and then Ranga.
Okay, thank you so much, Adi. It is true, there are challenges in our regional trade, many challenges, challenges of non-tariff barriers, challenges of standards, challenges around infrastructure. But despite all those challenges, there are better prospects if we address our regional integration and be able to organize our trade, because that's the only way we can be able to industrialize. There is no way you are going to take pangas and plastics and all those to Europe, If we want to create jobs, add value, we need to organize our regional trade. So if there are challenges within the regional trade, the answer is not to jump ship and go and start taking vegetables to EU. For me, I don't think that makes sense. Let us sit, let us organize our trade. And there are already efforts in place at the EAC to organize our trade. There are committees on NTBs. So let us, this is our baby, you know, let us make it work. For me, I don't have it to that alternative that, okay, let us go to EU. So let us make our regional integration work. After that, let us make the CFTA, the intra-Africa trade, work. For me, that's the way forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Ranga, comrade?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Jane, for that. Let me conclude by saying 2 wrongs cannot make a right. If there are any challenges within the EAC, that's why it's important to develop binding instruments that accompanies regional integration. One of the challenges that we have at the regional levels, whether it is in SADC, whether it is in EAC, is that some of the instruments that we put in place, they are not legally binding on our economies. And as a result, we end up having countries implementing willy-nilly provisions that they believe perhaps benefit them, and then they don't implement provisions that they believe will benefit others. So it's important that this is an in-house issue that needs to be addressed, and that's why we need to have protocols, we need to have instruments that are legally binding on all countries, and if we implement them, no country will come in at one stage and increase tariffs on certain products without even giving a warning to others. We will have to implement the instruments in letter and in spirit. That's why I continue to emphasize, and I've said it earlier on, that institutional building is very important. Institution building is very important. The institutions that we have at the EAC level, they have to be respected together with any accompanying legal instruments that are in place. And once we do that, and this is necessary for regional integration, you cannot have chaos within a regional economic community like the EAC. It's important to deal with that. So jumping ship to go to the EU because nothing is working out at the regional level cannot solve the challenges that we have. We need to have clear implementation of our own instruments in terms of the laws that exist within our own regions. That's my input into this. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Comrade Ranga, for indeed giving these alternatives and to Gento. I think that we have no more questions, no more proposals, but just to say we have shared the final statement. It is also on the website of CIATINI Uganda. Thank you so much for being with us. Allow me to hand over to Secretariat for the final aspects. Secretariat. Over to you, Secretariat.
Thank you so much, Comrade Africa. Thank you for moderating this very important press conference. I wish to, first of all, thank our very good speakers. That's Ms. Jane Nalunga, the Executive Director of CIATINI Uganda, Faith Lumonya, our comrade in the struggle, Ranga Machemese, our colleague from Southern Africa, and specifically working in Zimbabwe, and also to the various participants, distinguished participants who have joined us and stayed around for this press conference. Thank you for joining us. And like Jane shared earlier, the struggle continues. It's not ending here. And our quest for trade and social justice is still on. So it's just to call upon us to join this struggle to make sure that we stop the EPAs because of their inherent dangers that we've over the years highlighted, and of course we continue to highlight. And the Kenya EU EPA is not any different from the EPAs that we've been fighting against, because it has far-reaching implications, not just to Kenya's economy, but also to East African community as a whole. And also it stands in the way of the AfCFTA implementation, which has a number of promises that if nothing stands in its way, and if it's well tailored to support structural transformation of Africa, it will indeed yield greater benefits for all African countries. Once again, thank you, the comrades from the Fourth Estate, for joining us, and thank you all. I wish you a great evening. Let's continue engaging. The quest for social justice and trade justice is not ending here. Let's keep in touch. Thank you.
There is a question that will the recording be shared? Okay, yes. The recording will be shared, comrades. So thank you so much, and have a great evening, everyone. Bye.
Asante sana.
Ranga, that's a good one. You are integrating.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, comrade.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.